Hi everyone, it's Jakov, and due to a new version of Last Alliance Total War being released, I'm here with a new video breaking down one of the two new factions added to the mod, the Principality of Edhellond. If you're new here, the Last Alliance Total War is a mod for Total War Shogun 2 set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, being somewhat of a prequel timeline-wise to Total War The Dawnless Days, a mod for Total War Attila set in the Third Age instead. As of making this video, the mod is in development, being in the version 0.3.5 alpha, progressively getting closer to a full release, currently having more than a few factions in a campaign ready to play. For those of you interested in the mod, I'm going to leave it linked in the description, and I do encourage you to play. Today's video, as I said, will be a faction breakdown, with me going over the history within both the books and films of Tolkien's universe of the Principality of Edhellond before looking at the civilizations that inspired it in real life. After that, I'm going to look at the factions units and break them down, covering their battlefield roles as well as looking at their equipment and seeing how historically authentic it is. Edhellond is an ancient harbour found in what would become southern Gondor during the First Age of Middle-earth by elves fleeing the wars of Morgoth to the west, the elves primarily being the seafaring Sindarin elves who would later intermix with Sylvan elves, enlarging the population of the area. For thousands of years the settlement endured, having strong ties with the Galadrim elves of Lorien, many ships of the elves sailing from Edhellond to the Undying Lands in the west, after the fall of the elven kingdom of Eregion to the Dark Lord Sauron, although the elven settlement would exist into the Third Age, when the last of their kind finally left Adelande behind after the Balrog of Moria was unleashed, the great elven port being left deserted to fade away into history. While nothing is known of the action of these elves during the War of the Last Alliance, it seems almost certain that they would have fought alongside the last alliance of men and elves, one of the rulers of Edhellond, the elf Amroth, fighting in that conflict. Edhellond barely appears in the written works of Tolkien, popping up rarely in the Lord of the Rings books, its most prominent showings being in Unfinished Tales and in the Silmarillion, not appearing or being mentioned at all in any of the Peter Jackson film adaptations. In terms of historical cultures which could have inspired the faction, the main one that stands out to me is Venice, both being harbour cities greatly associated with seafarers, both being settlements founded by refugees fleeing the destruction of war. With the history of the faction both in and out of universe looked at, let's move on to the units themselves. Unlike the Dawnless Days, in which generals can sometimes be more elite units that can be used multiple times in one army, the generals in this mod are unique, with each faction generally only having two generals, the Principality of Edhellond having two general options. The first of these options are the Galadrim bodyguard, the Galadrim being the elves of Lothlorien who more or less had suzerainty over Edhellond. Looking at the Galadrim bodyguard, they're quite well armoured, having helmets resembling ancient Greek Corinthian helmets, except they have a head crest which brings to mind the spiked helmet of the Witch King of Angmar. These elven helmets being decorated with etchings of trees reflecting their heritage as the elves of the woods of Lorien. In addition to their helmets, some elves in the unit also have hoods for additional stealth. For body armour, they wear scale hauberks that have rider splits for some reason, despite the fact that these warriors are very much infantry. Over the top of the hauberk, some elves wear breastplates also etched with trees and branches, while others just have the scale hauberk, all however wearing a vest over their chests decorated with more foliage. For their arms, the elves have pauldrons over their shoulders, while their forearms are protected by decorated plate vambraces, their hands however remaining unarmoured. Protecting their legs underneath their scale hauberk, they have a buff leather coat, while their shins are protected by greaves, wearing only leather boots for their feet. Finally, to round out their clothing, they have green and brown cloaks, which are most likely the same as those given to the Fellowship by the elves of Lothlorien during the War of the Ring. For shields, they all have large round shields similar to the ancient Greek hoplon slung over their backs, providing back protection from enemy archers, this being a common use for shields. The shields themselves aren't very historical, being rimmed in metal and enamelled with green to resemble leaves. A nice motif for the fashion, but not really something that was done in real life. Metal rims at the very least not seen used on hoplons, while enamelling for such shields is unheard of, especially for equipment designed to see actual service rather than ceremonial items. For weapons, the elves carry axes at their side, these one-handed axes having long shafts with somewhat bearded design for their head, making for a nasty weapon which works well in combination with their shields. However, the main weapon of these warriors are their mighty recurve bows. The bows of the Galadrim being considered the best in Middle-earth in terms of range and power, these wooden bows being made of the magical Malorn trees of Lothlorien. I will say that for recurve bows, these do seem quite large. Recurve bows being famously used by many horse peoples of the steppes such as the Mongolians, who used the weapon to great effect in building their empire, the recurve bow's traditional compactness making it perfect for shooting on horseback as well as for use in dense vegetation, something the Galadrim are famous for fighting in. Turning to the unit officer, he is equipped identically to his troops apart from his helmet, which is a crest that is decorated with the Malorn tree symbol of Lorien. Overall, while these are meant to be among the heaviest and most elite of the elves deployed by the faction, their significantly lighter equipment compared to the other elven factions in the mod helps show off that these elves aren't quite as capable or as advanced as their more powerful Noldorin kin. As a unit, these guys are a very balanced general unit, boosting your ranged forces by providing you extra firepower at a pinch, while also capable of taking up position in the battle line and going to town with their axes. While they aren't the most powerful general unit in the mod and are vulnerable to cavalry, for their price they're a great budget general that will serve adequately in all circumstances. Moving on to the second general option for the faction, we have Amroth, the King of Lorien and the Principality of Edhellond, leading the Galadrim Swan Guard. Amroth was the son of King Amdir, the elven leader of Lothlorien who died during the Battle of Dagorlad during the War of the Last Alliance, alongside many other elves due to Amdir's recklessness. Amroth coming to rule both Lothlorien and Edhellond, where he would meet his end after drowning trying to swim back to shore to meet his beloved elf maiden Nimrodel. Looking at the warriors in the unit, they're all obviously cavalry, being mounted atop unarmoured horses. In terms of armour, they have more or less the same outfit as the previous unit, though all in the unit have a turquoise enamelled breastplate as a unit standard, the breastplate having a silver tree etched onto it. Such highly decorated and colourful breastplates being a common sight on most wealthy soldiers in the late Middle Ages. Other points of difference with the previous unit is the fact that these elves have pauldrons shaped to resemble swan wings, and that their van bases and greaves are partially enamelled blue. The other main points of difference are their robes and cloaks, which are coloured turquoise, and their helmets, which share the same basic design seen before but are also enamelled turquoise, as well as to varying extents, with massive cheek guards extending to become wings, making these helmets resemble the winged helmet of Hermes in Greek mythology. These helmets also massively remind me of those used by the Swan Knights of Dol Amroth in the Third Age, specifically their depiction in Total War the Dauntless Days. In fact, this unit more or less resembling them, being an ancient forerunner to them of sorts. Turning to their equipment, for shields they use large metal shields in a roughly rectangular shape reminiscent of the Roman scutum or the pavese shields of the Middle Ages, although these shields in particular are designed to look like the wings of swans, which while not a historical look is nonetheless pretty damn cool and adds to the unit's aesthetic, helping to differentiate it. For weapons, the elves have nice one-handed flanged axes that wouldn't look out of place in the Middle Ages, and which make a lot of sense for mounted horsemen, as axes can be devastating when running down enemies on foot, sending heads flying. Turning to Amroth himself, he's equipped identically to his troops except for his helmet, which is even more enamelled and has a metal swan decorating it, such decorations being seen and used by knights in the joust rather than on the battlefield. Overall, as a unit, these guys do pack more of a punch in close combat than the Galadriel bodyguard, though it should be noted that these guys are melee cavalry rather than shock cavalry, lacking lances, which means they aren't necessarily as devastating on the charge as some other cavalry they may face off against. That said, they're a great unit for use as a mobile reserve, filling in gaps in the line where necessary while also capable of pinning down enemy horsemen, though keeping them away from enemy spearmen and charges from shock cavalry is a recommendation to keep note of. Overall, I'd suggest recruiting these guys over the Galadriel bodyguard in most situations, except for sieges where their range skills are far more valuable. Now that we've covered these guys, let's move on to the first spear unit fielded by the faction, the Philathrim Light Spearmen. If you've seen my previous videos, this unit might seem familiar given that it also appears in the Kingdom of Linden lineup. The Philathrim are the seafarers of the elves, so it makes sense that one of their main ports would have a contingent of these elves available. Looking at their armour, they wear helmets which look very much like those used by the companion cavalry of Alexander the Great, as well as the burgonets of the early Middle Ages. For the rest of their outfit, they're fairly lightly armoured, wearing blue tunics of a variety of shades, over which they wear a half cuirass of scale armour reminiscent of those worn by Greek hoplites and the loica squamata used by the Romans, although half cuirasses themselves aren't something I've ever heard of. Some of the cuirasses have scale shoulder straps while others have pauldrons. Apart from this, they only have plate greaves and van bases, which really adds to the ancient Greek aesthetic. This light armour makes sense given that these warriors are seafarers by trade, so if they see fighting at sea, they want to be as lightly equipped as possible given that armour is a death sentence if you fall overboard. For shields, they use large metal bucklers which remind me of the smaller pelter shields used by the Macedonian phalanxes of antiquity, while for weapons they have long-hafted axes at their side, although their main weapons are a mix of glaives and spears which resemble the Japanese naginata. In addition to these weapons, these warriors can also skirmish, throwing projectiles at enemies, which gives them a bit more firepower than expected. Turning to their officer, he's far more heavily armoured than his troops, wearing a turquoise enamelled Corinthian helmet, while his body is protected by a scale hauberk over which he wears turquoise plate, specifically a breastplate which is shaped to look like overlapping robes, bringing to mind the loica segmentata of the Roman legionaries, the plate having folds attached to protect the officer's upper legs. For the rest of his legs he wears a pair of turquoise greaves, while his arms are protected by spoulders and van bases, making for a heavily armoured warrior, albeit one with vulnerable upper legs, a warrior who uses the same spear and shield as his troops. As a unit, these guys are the lightest spearmen the faction has access to, something reflected by their lacking stats. However, their skirmish capabilities help make up for their performance somewhat, giving them extra firepower power that can be leveraged at the right time to break down a resilient foe, making them that much more useful. Overall, I definitely incorporate these guys into early army builds, although once heavier spearmen become available, you won't need to rely on their gimmick of skirmish capabilities, although when defending fortifications, they can at a pinch provide you with that bit more range support. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadrim Spearmen. These elves wear the Galadrim bodyguard helmet but simplified and made of bronze, their body armour being mail shirts over which they wear brown and green surcoats, apart from that having greaves and van braces for protection. For shields they use large wooden shields with metal rims, the shield resembling a cross between kite shields and the ancient shields used by the Celts with their side cutouts, the shields also looking very much like those used by the Noldorin warriors of Lindon. This resemblance of the shields of the High Elves is intentional and helps show the difference between the different groups of elves, these lesser elves being forced to rely on wooden shields rather than metal shields, the warriors' general armour also being far less advanced. In addition to these kite shields decorated with paintings of malorn trees, they have axes at their side and the same spears as the previous unit, the officer being equipped the same as the elves of the Galadrim Guard, except for his shield and spear. As a unit, these guys are your mid-game line spearmen, being the bulwark of your forces when forced into open battle. When it comes to stats, these guys are better than the previous unit, making them that much more hardy, although it should be noted that these guys do lack the skirmish abilities of the Philathrim light spearmen, although I'd say that's a fair trade. Overall, a very useful unit that is good even in a support role once better units become available. Speaking of better units, we have the Philathrim Spearmen, who are also shared by the Kingdom of Lindon. These warriors wear the same armour as the light spearman officer except without any enamelling. Another change that the troops in this unit have is that some of them only have greaves protecting their legs, while others have mail pants over which they have greaves, giving them that much more protection. For shields, they use large round shields coated in metal, very much like the ancient Greek hoplons, the shield type being very much historic and one that I like to see. Skipping their weapons and officer, which we've both seen before, these guys are your late game professional spearmen, being pretty damn tough, although compared to the elite spearmen fielded by the Noldorin elves, these guys are still lesser, indicating that open clashes on the battlefield isn't this faction's forte, that it only really performs adequately at best in clashes of shield wars. As a unit, these guys should be the defensive core of your army designed to buy time so your ranged forces can thin out enemy ranks, but shouldn't be relied on to be battle winners by their lonesome. Overall, a very useful unit that enables the faction to have some field presence, if not at the level of the most powerful factions in the mod. With these guys covered, all the spearmen of the faction have been looked at, so we'll move on to their melee infantry, beginning with the Galadrim clan warriors. These warriors are extremely lightly armoured, wearing only robes and cloaks, all of them having helmets crested with metal leaves similar to the helmets used by the Numenorians. That these guys use helmets is something I really appreciate, as the one bit of armour warriors prioritise were helmets, given how important the body part they protect is. Apart from their helmets, they do also have van braces for their forearms. Some of these troops wear cloaks over their helmets, which makes sense given these guys are meant to be ambush warriors, emerging from the trees to slaughter unsuspecting foes. For shields, they use small wooden bucklers rimmed with metal and decorated with paintings of leaves and malorn trees. These shields are actually shaped somewhat like leaves or pears, which is an interesting shape. While I can't say I've seen it before, I can't say that it's exactly ahistorical either. In combination with these shields, the warriors use one-handed flanged axes straight out of the 13th century. The unit officers are equipped identically to the elves of the Galadrim Spearmen, except that he uses a small shield and an axe. As a unit, these guys are the core part of your early armies, being the bulk of your forces, being more or less a match for most beginner units, where cavalry and massed archers can devastate them. I suggest using guerrilla tactics with these guys, ambushing your enemies where possible with short charges from cover, the unit not being great on the open battlefield against serried ranks of heavy infantry. Overall, I'd use these guys plentifully early on, but once better troops become available, they should be phased out as quickly as possible. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadrim Shock Troops, who are essentially the Galadrim Spearmen, who choose to discard their shields and dual-wield one-handed axes. While dual-wielding wasn't exactly common on the battlefield, it was something that could happen and was recorded as occurring. And if you're going to dual-wield, two axes seem as good a weapon as any. Skipping their officer who we've seen before, these guys can make up the core of your army in the mid-game if a highly offensive build is what you're going for. Very much a stealth unit, these guys can remain hidden even on the open battlefield, which makes it a very nicely surprise when an entire army of these guys appears from nowhere and begin mauling your formations. Overall, a very useful unit that helps distinguish this faction's playstyle, although you should try and keep them away from cavalry or heavy archer concentrations, as they can tear these guys apart. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadrim Swornin, who are a mix between mid-tier and professional warriors. Armor-wise, these elves wear the same helmets, greaves, van braces and robes we've seen before, however their chests are protected by uniform scale shirts, scale being a widely used form of armor in antiquity and the Middle Ages to a certain point. The warrior's armour however leaves their upper legs quite exposed, which is a cause for worry. For weapons they use the same axes and bucklers we've seen before, the officer too essentially being a Galadrim Spearmen officer. As a unit, these guys are more or less your line infantry in the later game. While they are most definitely necessary, they're still quite underpowered compared to the heavy infantry fielded by other factions such as the Dwarves, Elves, and Numenoreans. As such, these guys are more or less always going to be fighting at somewhat of a disadvantage, being the best that the Elves of Edelond can muster. With these guys covered, all the melee infantry have been looked at. Let's turn to their ranged units, the true strength of the faction, beginning with the Galadrim household. These elves are entirely unarmoured, wearing just their robes, having axes at their side in case of melee, and recurved bows in their hands for dealing out death at range. Their officer is a standard Galadrim warrior using a recurved bow like his troop, so we'll look at the unit as a whole. Overall, these guys are a core part of your beginning army, being your ranged support that your army needs more than anything else if victory is to be achieved. Not exactly the most durable of warriors, these elves should be kept out of melee at all costs, as they aren't likely to last long against any opposition. I suggest using these troops en masse to thin out hordes of lightly armoured foes in the early game, as well as opposing archers, as the bows of the Galadrim give these guys a range advantage over their foes, although once better troops become available, replacing them is a good idea. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadrim Clan Archers, essentially Galadrim Spearmen using recurve bows. More heavily armoured than the previous unit and thus hardier, these guys are yet another stealth unit that can rain down death on unsuspecting foes, although getting caught in melee is a bad idea. Once these guys become available, I'd recruit them in large numbers and seed the battlefield with them, peppering enemy formations from more directions so as to keep them off their toes. Overall, a very useful unit that will be the core of your range strength for the mid-game. Moving on, we have the Falathrim Archers, who are armoured identically to the Falathrim Spearmen. These troops and their officer keeping a buckler like those of the light spearmen slung over their back. For weapons, apart from the ubiquitous axe, they use recurve bows closer to those used by the peoples of the steppe, as well as sailors, which makes sense given the Falathrim tie to the sea, compact weapons being at a premium on the tight quarters of a ship. As a unit, these guys are very much heavier than the clan archers, however they lack their stealth capabilities. Because of this, I'd say both units work well in tandem with one another, these guys providing a visible threat for enemies to respond to while your clan archers ambush them like intended. Apart from working in tandem, these guys can also be very useful when fighting in sieges as a way of filling up on archers. Overall, a very useful unit that meshes well with the faction's playstyle, surprisingly. Moving on, we have the Galadrim March Wardens, who are the bow equivalent of the Galadrim Sworn In, appearing identical to that unit apart from their recurve bows. As a unit, these guys are your professional archer unit, possessing incredible range which allows them to outshoot any foe in the game, while their stealth abilities mean they can shoot literally from anywhere. Add this to the fact that they can somewhat handle themselves in melee, and you've got an all-around great unit that will be the core of your late-game armies, used in large numbers to drown enemies in arrows. Moving on to the next unit that Adelande has access to, we have the Galadrim Old Realm Archers, who for all intents and purposes are the Galadrim Bodyguard, with a bit extra as each elf in this unit has a Dane axe on their backs. This makes the unit a mixed range shock infantry unit, which is quite the mix, having the best range in the mod I'm pretty sure, allowing for these warriors to shoot the enemy consistently before they close, which is when these guys draw their weapons and smash into the survivors of the arrow hailstorm. An incredibly dangerous unit, these guys are what you should be aiming for when building the most late game army you can, these guys being best suited for being the spear tip of your army until you can use them as the bulk of your force. A very devastating unit that boosts the firepower of the faction considerably, and gives it an answer to the heavy armies fielded by other factions. Moving on to the last category of unit fielded by the faction, we have Cavalry, beginning with the Galadrim Mounted March Wardens. As the name suggests, these warriors are Galadrim March Wardens atop unarmoured horses, the warriors using their light shields and axes until they bring out their bows, which might not actually make sense. While recurve bows on horseback very much make sense, the recurve bows of the Galadrim are almost if not as big as longbows, which couldn't be used on horseback due to the large size. Because of this, I'd assume they're unable to use their bows effectively, although maybe because they're elves they have some magic enabling them to do so. As a unit, these guys are your standard mounted archers, harassing enemy formations and forcing them to respond to your plays rather than make their own. These guys can be useful on the charge at a pinch when hitting stuck enemy units in the rear, although trying to use them against shock cavalry in a head-to-head fight is a bad idea. It's also useful to acknowledge, like all mounted archers, these guys have a shorter range than foot archers, so they're vulnerable to return fire. Overall, a unit that can very much be used to swarm enemies and is perfect for the hit-and-run tactics the Galadrim are known for. Moving on to the next unit, we have the Galadrim Swan Lancers. Essentially the Galadrim Swan Guard led by Amaroth. These warriors have the exact same armor but are differentiated by their weapons, using the same spears and glaives we've seen before. As a unit, these guys give you a mobile armoured fist that can be used to counter most enemy cavalry and threaten your foe's rear and flanks, being great at tearing apart enemy units weakened by harassment by your archers. Overall, these guys are a very useful unit that gives Edelond some much needed muscle, being perfect at bringing about victories. With these guys covered, every unit in the faction has been looked at, so let's move on to the faction as a whole. The Principality of Edhellond is a faction that has a very unique playstyle, relying very much on ambushing enemy forces and thinning them out with guerrilla warfare, rather than meeting them in massive clashes on the open battlefield. As such, the units the faction has are suited towards such combat, although the faction does field units designed to give them a fighting chance in clashes. That said, the faction can pivot when it comes to its game plan, massive armies of archers picking off the enemy in arrow storms being just as much of a valid strategy as hitting them hard and fast with mass shock infantry, with skirmish and shock cavalry helping to round out the faction's tactics. While they could have very much been an underpowered faction, their stealth abilities and their cavalry are their saving grace, giving you a different playstyle that is massively appreciated, as it helps the mod stay fresh and makes each faction that much more playable, although I will say that these guys could very much be considered gimmicky. With all that said, my breakdown of the Principality of Edelond is over, although due to this not being the only faction added to the mod in the most recent update, I'll be back soon with another video for the Last Alliance Total War, though other videos such as battle videos and army builds will be coming up. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing out.